I want to talk about something personal, emotional, political, and traumatic. It's something we felt hit closer to home than many of us thought possible in our country and our lifetimes. Anti-Semitism. In recent years, we've been scared or saddened by mass shootings at synagogues, by stabbings of Jews on the street, vandalism, toxic campus environments, cringeworthy comments by public officials, and even social media posts by friends that crossed the line. I was out not 2 blocks from my home when I witnessed a woman, the epitome of a soccer mom, driving a minivan, yell out her open window, "Die, you effing Jew," at the driver in front of her because he didn't accelerate as fast as she would have liked. It was beyond jarring. But what I want to address is not anti-Semitism itself. I want to consider our reaction to it. There are experts far more knowledgeable than I in diagnosing the problem, who can help us understand the origins of the hatred and its ability to adapt to every era of history. And there is no perfect way to uproot something so insidious and pervasive. There's no easy fix. Yet I worry that the tactics that we've leaned into as a community have not always served us well. There is much beyond our control, but we're not maximizing what is. The high holidays are a time of self-reflection, of considering how we want to walk through the world, of how our agency can take us min hamitzar, from a narrow place. Let me be clear. I am not victim blaming. Anti-Semitism is a real and malignant cancer in our society. But not all treatments are equal. And treatments are only effective when appropriate for that particular case. So if we hope to have a greater impact in addressing anti-Semitism, we must take a critical look at the treatments we are using to respond. First, the most pervasive impulse I have witnessed is that our political identity is stronger than our Jewish identity when it comes to anti-Semitism. Our politics shade the type of anti-Semitism we deem most dangerous. If you are on the left, it is the anti-Semitism of white supremacy and the alt-right, the anti-Semitism of right-wing extremists who plot murder and target Jewish institutions with their stockpile of guns. If you are on the right, it is the anti-Semitism of street attacks against religious Jews, toxic campus politics about Israel, and anti-Zionism. Our fatal flaw on both sides of the political spectrum has been the ease with which we call out anti-Semitism on the other side, while turning a blind eye toward it on our own. We have to find the courage not only to call out the anti-Semitism over there, but to take it on among our friends and our partners. If we are serious about fighting anti-Semitism, then we need to address it where we actually have influence. We invest so much energy yelling across the divide to people who are already inclined not to listen to us. Our righteous indignation and our snarky social media posts must give way to patience, gentle confrontation, and real vulnerability as we speak with those who share our outlook on the world, who sometimes hurt us through the things that they say or do, or through the things that they ignore. It is in our power to have these difficult conversations in our own midst, in a place where we are likely to have an impact. Second, as a community, we treat most acts with the same level of alarm. You may remember the Ben & Jerry's controversy of earlier this summer when the company declared that it would no longer sell its product in the West Bank. Wherever you fall on that controversy, the fact that it garnered more attention, more thought pieces, more outrage than Jewish people actually getting stabbed in the streets is a misapplication of our priorities. We have to develop a more sophisticated sense of alarm based on the gravity of the act and distinguish between what we may consider to be misjudgment and malice. This is particularly true in our conversations about Israel. We will not all agree about exactly where to draw the line between appropriate critique, anti-Zionism, and whether that equates to anti-Semitism. But I worry that flattening the conversation and the speed with which we call out anti-Semitism make us weaker when we really need to call out the most egregious and dangerous acts. We become the people who cried wolf, and others inevitably stop listening. Third, we often reach for shame and isolation as our first tool of combat. These can be powerful tools to compel an apology or change in behavior. And there exist people so incurably rabid with hate that this tactic is the best approach. But shame will almost always fail to address the underlying hatred and can even exacerbate it by further fueling resentment. I think on a gut level we know this. It's striking to me that we don't celebrate stories of shame and isolation in the way that we celebrate stories of teshuvah and transformation, like the story of Derek Black. Raised in the most central circles of white nationalist thought, Derek's father was a grand wizard of the KKK, and his mother was previously married to David Duke. He went to college fully immersed in this supremacist ideology when he was outed and shunned for his beliefs. But one Jewish student, Matthew Stevenson, chose a different approach. When the news broke about Black's affiliation, many people I saw treating Derek very poorly, Matthew said, trying to make his life as miserable as possible, and what I think may have been a misguided attempt to change the situation. And at the time, I'd been hosting these Shabbat dinners in my dorm room every Friday night, along with my close friend, Moshe Ash. We knew that Derek had grown up in a white nationalist family among white nationalist royalty, so to speak, and probably didn't know any people from the backgrounds that his ideology despised. So, for that reason, we decided to invite Derek to come. Derek attended these Shabbat dinners, and slowly his lived experience with Jewish friends couldn't help but replace his anti-Semitic indoctrination. Derek eventually renounced his views and has become a nationally recognized thought leader on combating hate and white nationalism. Today, we celebrate Matthew Stevenson for the friendship that he forged with Derek Black. But back when he was doing the work, Matthew received a lot of criticism by people on campus for what he was doing, including friends who had been coming to these dinners previously and stopped because they didn't want to be around Derek. We may celebrate the success of these stories after the fact, but we don't lay the conditions to make them happen as a community. Instead, we not only isolate those who have exhibited problematic behavior, but also those who choose to engage with them. We look at the Matthew Stevensons and the Derek Blacks as miraculous one-offs, not as a model to replicate. The head of the Shoah Foundation, Stephen Smith, shared a similar story with me of a professional athlete's anti-Semitic tweet. Rather than join the cacophony of calls for cancellation and withdrawal of endorsement deals, Stephen reached out to engage him. And sure enough, that athlete has become one of the best anti-hate speakers for his students. Our own members of Chai Village have been engaging in a program with some local kids who didn't think twice about a swastika-infused party that ended up on social media. Ask any of those who participated. They have built extraordinarily meaningful relationships with these kids. As one congregant, Sandy Silas, shared with me, I was able to look beyond the act of defilement and see young people who were scared and screaming for attention and to be heard. Their defiance was a mask to cover their fear. I identified with the fear. And as I offered them ways to feel empowered, I too felt less alone and empowered myself. We were all able to feel a sense of purpose. Just think about what could happen if this impulse to engage was less revolutionary and more standard. How many people we could transform into our allies and advocates, not just shame, into silence and submission. Building real, trusting relationships is one of our most powerful tools. And yet, it so often gets dismissed as kumbaya fluff. Which brings me to my last critique of our communal response to anti-Semitism. And perhaps the one that might sting the most. I have heard the refrain from our community. Where are our friends? Where are our allies? As comedian Sarah Silverman said, it makes me sad to know that so many Jews I know commit their lives to being allies to so many, to stick their necks out for others, and I'm proud of that. That's always going to be our way. But who is here for us? I know that these words resonate for many of us, who see so many Jews at the forefront of other fights for justice, for racial equality, for LGBTQ rights, for women's equality, and feel left in a lurch when the hate comes in our direction. But perhaps the way we see ourselves as a community that is known for showing up for the fight is not the way that others perceive us. Every year when I take the teens to Washington, D.C. for our Reform Jewish Justice program, Litaken, where we lobby Congress from a place of Jewish values, the students learn the history of our movement. That the groundbreaking civil rights legislation of the 1960s was composed at the home of the Religious Action Center, the advocacy wing of the Reform movement. We emphasize to the students that we, Reform Jews, were there in lockstep with the leaders of the civil rights movement. But what we fail to acknowledge is that we are centering our self-understanding today on events that happened more than a half century ago. In more recent decades, the deep and profound alliances and relationships that predominantly white Jewish institutions had with communities of color and folks suffering from oppression have become less and less and less of a communal priority for us. Yes, individual Jews have always been part of these movements and even disproportionately represented. But our institutional priorities shifted. The national organizations that once touted a robust domestic agenda of equality and justice have turned their focus more and more inward on Jewish communal concerns of continuity, education, and Israel. The Jewish Community Relations Councils that once represented our community and stood in solidarity in these spaces have been mostly dismantled or diminished. As Dr. Stephen Windmuller, an expert in Jewish community relations, notes, this is particularly true in our own backyard. Los Angeles is the only major American Jewish community without a community relations structure. Even though there are deep political divisions within our own community, he says, it is imperative to have a central organization representing Jewish interests. In times like today, a period of great social and racial unrest, the Jewish community needs to be seen as collectively responsive. In recent decades, when we have made intentional efforts to outreach to other communities, it is often done through the lens of what is a priority for us, and comes frequently in the form of subsidized trips to Israel so they understand this issue from our perspective. We have not been as great about asking and really understanding what matters to other communities. The relationships feel shallower, more transactional. Now, without question, there are exceptions to this trend, but they are just that, exceptions, not the rule. So while masses of Jewish individuals show up, the Jewish community as a community tends to feel absent to other communities in need. Or worse, others think of the Jewish community as adversarial to their movements. Our institutions have distanced themselves from the larger fight for justice because we process it first and foremost through its connection to us, through problematic statements and critiques about Israel from subsets of these movements. It's counterintuitive, but the more we really focus on understanding and showing up for others, the more trust and space we create to articulate when something that they have done hurts us. And it creates the space for us to be heard. Last week, Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League issued a formal apology for the way that the ADL did not support the Cordoba House, dubbed in the media as the Ground Zero Mosque more than a decade ago. As he wrote, the ADL's stance on the Cordoba House project was a punch in the gut to the Muslim community. I hope that by righting this wrong, we can be better allies in the fight against the rise in anti-Muslim hate that is coming. And it is coming. He's articulating the need for our organizations to show up for others in the fight that matters to them, not just to us. That work will go a long way for moments when our community is in need. Much of this sermon and my analysis comes from a really personal place for me. Having started my career in forging Muslim-Jewish relations, rejected and isolated by the mainstream Jewish community for choosing to engage with folks who disagreed on Israel, witnessing firsthand how deep relationships can allow for more nuanced conversations about controversial issues, including Israel. Being able to say when something crosses the line and having that heard and respected. That work is neither sexy nor public, but it is also the only time I have witnessed anything other than entrenchment in these arguments. When we choose to walk away from the table, we leave a void without any Jewish perspective. And whatever problems of anti-Semitism existed in the first place, they certainly will not lessen in our absence. There is so much about anti-Semitism that is beyond our control. But it's time for us to reclaim the power we do have, to break free of the narrow place in which we find ourselves, to target the best treatment to the type of cancer that we face. It's time for our community to stop undercutting each other based on our politics, to better discern real threats from what riles up the base, to believe in the power of teshuvah and transformation over shame, and for us to show up for others, to reinvest in the thickness of relationships and connections that we have let fray over the decades. As Rabbi Sarah Bassin reflects on the relationship between the Jewish theologian Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and his alliance with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement, what gets left out of the story is that they were actual friends. Shana Tova.